The dust settled in the quiet space between breaths. It coated the woman's worn dress, the cracked leather of her shoes, and the pale, sleeping face of the child in her arms. She stood at the gate, a line drawn in the dirt between the vast, unforgiving prairie behind her and the promise of a well, a house, a life ahead. Her name was Elara, though the wind seemed intent on stealing it from her lips before she could speak it. The gate was closed. Beyond it, a man stood on the porch of a simple timber house, a silhouette against the dying sun. He was as still as the mountains on the horizon, his presence a challenge, a question mark carved into the landscape. He did not move for a long time. He watched her. His gaze was not cruel, nor was it kind. It was a gaze of assessment, like a man judging the sky for rain or the soil for planting. A small boy, a miniature version of the man's stillness, peeked out from behind his father's leg. Elara's daughter, Lily, stirred in her sleep, a soft whimper escaping her chapped lips. The sound broke the spell. The man on the porch moved. He did not call out. He descended the 3 wooden steps and walked toward the gate with a steady, unhurried pace. His boots made soft thuds in the dirt. He was tall, built of the kind of lean strength that comes from hard labor, not from a gymnasium. His face was weathered, a map of sun and wind and silence. He stopped on his side of the gate, his hands resting on the top rail. He looked at the child, then at Elara. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held no judgment, only a deep, unnerving quiet. Elara's throat was a desert. She had rehearsed a speech, a plea for water, for a crust of bread, for a night's rest in a barn. But the words turned to ash in her mouth. His silence demanded the same in return. He looked her over, saw the desperation she tried to hide, the fierce protectiveness in her grip on the child. He saw the bruises, faded but still present, on her neck, peeking from the collar of her dress. He saw that she was running, and that she was done running. He unlatched the gate. The screech of the metal was the loudest sound for a mile. He swung it open, leaving a path for her. He did not invite her in. He simply made it possible. Elara hesitated for a heartbeat, her fear warring with her exhaustion. She took a step, then another, crossing the threshold onto his land. He closed the gate behind her, the latch clicking shut with a sound of finality. He turned and walked back toward the house. She was expected to follow. She did. The small boy, Caleb, watched her approach with wide, curious eyes. He had his father's silence. As Elara reached the porch, the man turned. He had not offered water, had not asked her name or her trouble. He looked from the weary woman to her sleeping child, then to his own boy, who now stood beside him, clutching a fold of his trousers. The man's lips, which seemed unused to forming words, parted. His voice was low, rough, like stone grating on stone. "Your child needs a father," he stated. It was not a question. It was an observation, as plain and solid as the house he had built. He paused, his gaze unwavering. "My son needs a mother." Elara's breath caught in her throat. The words hung in the air, more shocking than a gunshot. It was not a proposal of marriage in any way she had ever imagined. There was no romance, no courtship, not even a hint of affection. It was a transaction. A contract of survival laid bare on a dusty porch at the edge of the world. She stared at him, searching his face for a sign of mockery, of cruelty, of madness. She found none. There was only a stark, brutal pragmatism. She had come here expecting to beg for mercy, for a temporary kindness. She had not expected the offer to life, however strange and hollow its terms. Her mind raced, sifting through her options. There were none. Behind her lay the open prairie, and the men she was fleeing. The Hendersons, her dead husband's brothers, men who saw her and Lily not as family, but as property, a loose end to be tied up and discarded. Their faces, twisted with greed and cheap whiskey, swam in her memory. They would not stop hunting her. To them, she was a key to a secret, a mat they believed she held. To be found by them was a fate worse than any uncertainty this silent man could offer. She looked down at Lily, whose small chest rose and fell in the steady rhythm of innocent sleep. This was not for her. It was for the small, warm weight in her arms. She looked at the man's son, Caleb, a boy wrapped in a silence so profound it seemed like a shroud. He was watching her, his eyes holding a desperate, unspoken plea that mirrored her own. He, too, was a survivor of a loss she could only guess at. The man, Silas, did not press her. He waited, his patience as vast and unyielding as the land itself. He had made his offer. The rest was up to her. Elara finally looked at the house. It was not large, but it was solid. The wood was sound. The roof was whole. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, a promise of warmth against the coming chill of night. It was a fortress of solitude. It was safe. Safety was a currency she had not possessed for a very long time. She thought of the nights spent in ditches, of the constant fear that gnawed at her insides. Here, behind this man's quiet strength, that fear might finally be starved. She did not have the words to accept. Her voice, if she used it, would betray the tremor of her terror and relief. So she gave him her answer in his own language. She gave him a single slow nod. Her chin dipped once, a gesture of concession, of agreement, of surrender. Silas's expression did not change, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not relief, perhaps, but acknowledgment. The deal was struck. He turned and gestured toward an open door. "The room at the back is yours," he said. "There's water in the basin." He walked into the main room, his son trailing him like a shadow, leaving her on the porch. The sun had finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into shades of purple and gray. Elara stood for a moment longer, holding her daughter close, and breathed in the cool, clean air. It did not taste of freedom, not yet, but it tasted of a beginning. She stepped inside into the quiet house of the stranger who was now, by some twist of fate, to be her husband. The first days were a study in silence. The house was a vessel for 4 people who moved around each other like celestial bodies in a slow, predictable orbit, held in place by a gravity of unspoken rules. Silas would rise before the sun, his movements quiet and deliberate. He would tend to the fire, his large hands gentle with the kindling, and be out the door before Elara and Lily stirred. He spent his days in the fields, mending fences that seemed to have no end, his figure a distant, solitary shape against the vast expanse of the sky. Elara's world was the house and the small patch of land around it. She found a routine, a rhythm that pushed back against the chaos of her recent past. She cooked, she cleaned, she scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed, swept the dust from the corners, and washed the windows until the morning light streamed in, clear and bright. These were not chores, they were acts of reclamation. With each domestic task, she was not just cleaning a house. She was building a home, laying a foundation of order over the bedrock of her fear. Lily, too young to understand the strangeness of their situation, was a small beacon of light in the quiet gloom. Her laughter, when it came, seemed to echo in the rafters, a foreign and startling sound. She would follow Elara around, a chattering companion, her innocence a balm to her mother's frayed nerves. Caleb remained a mystery. He was his father's son, a creature of profound quiet. He would sit for hours on the porch steps, watching Silas in the distance, his hands busy with a small piece of wood and a dull knife, his attempts at carving clumsy and fruitless. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in a voice so soft it was barely a whisper. He kept his distance from Elara and Lily, a wary observer of the intruders in his world. Elara tried to bridge the gap. She would offer him a freshly baked biscuit, his favorite, she had learned. He would take it with a mumbled word of thanks, his eyes never meeting hers. She would speak to him gently, asking simple questions about his day, but his answers were always short, clipped, and final. One evening, as a chill wind howled outside, Elara sat by the fire, darning one of Lily's socks. Lily was asleep in the back room, and Silas was in the barn, tending to the livestock. Caleb sat at the far end of the table, struggling with his piece of wood. His small brow was furrowed in concentration, his lips pressed into a thin line of frustration. The knife slipped, and he let out a small, sharp cry, dropping the wood to the floor. Elara looked up. She saw not just his frustration, but the deep well of sadness behind it. She put down her sewing and walked over to him. She knelt by his chair, her movements slow, unthreatening. "It's hard work, carving," she said softly. He didn't look at her, just stared at the piece of wood on the floor. "My pa can do it," he whispered. "He can make anything." "I'm sure he can," Elara agreed. She picked up the piece of wood. It was meant to be a bird, she thought, but the shape was still rough and unformed. "He just takes his time with it. Good things take time." She handed it back to him. He took it, his small fingers closing around the wood. For the first time, he looked at her, truly looked at her. His eyes, so like his father's, were filled with a child's confusion and grief. He saw no pity in her face, only a quiet understanding. Later that night, as Elara checked on a sleeping Lily, she found a small, intricately carved bird sitting on the knitstand. It was smooth and perfect, its tiny wings poised for flight. She knew Silas had not been in the room. She looked out the window and saw him standing by the barn, looking up at the moon, a lone figure in the darkness. He had left the gift for Caleb to find, an act of fatherly love delivered in his own silent way. But Elara knew it was also a message for her. It was a promise, carved in wood, that in this house of silence, kindness could still take root and grow. A week later, the sky turned a bruised, angry purple. The wind, which had been a constant, restless companion, grew teeth. It whipped around the small house, rattling the windows in their frames and moaning through the cracks in the walls. A storm was coming, a physical manifestation of the turmoil that had brought them all to this place. Silas spent the day securing the farm. He hammered loose boards on the barn, checked the latches on the animal pens, and stacked extra firewood on the porch. He moved with a focused urgency, his silence more charged than ever. Elara watched him from the kitchen window, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She had always hated storms. They reminded her of her husband's rages, of a world thrown into violent, unpredictable chaos. Inside, she prepared as well. She made a thick stew, its hearty aroma filling the house and fighting back against the scent of rain on the dry earth. She ensured the lamps were full of oil and trimmed the wicks. She was creating a small pocket of warmth and light to defy the coming darkness. By evening, the first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, splattering against the window panes like thrown stones. Soon it was a deluge. The sky opened up, and the world outside the small house dissolved into a churning, roaring gray. Thunder cracked overhead, so loud it shook the floorboards, and lightning bleached the landscape in stark, terrifying flashes. Lily, who had been playing quietly on a rug by the fire, began to cry. The thunder frightened her. Elara gathered her into her arms, rocking her gently and humming a soft lullaby, her own fear masked for her daughter's sake. Caleb sat at the table, his face pale, but he was silent, his eyes fixed on his father. Silas sat in his chair, not reading, not working, just watching the storm, his presence a calm anchor in the turbulent house. Then came a new sound, a steady, rhythmic dripping. Drip, drip, drip. Elara looked up. A dark stain was spreading on the ceiling in the corner of the back room, her room. A leak. The drips grew faster, a miniature rainstorm inside their sanctuary. Before Elara could even react, Silas was on his feet. He said nothing. He simply walked to her room, his movements economical and swift. He examined the leak, then began moving her and Lily's few belongings, the small trunk, the bedding away from the spreading water. He shifted their mattress to the main room, placing it on the floor near the hearth, in the warmest part of the house. Elara watched, a lump in her throat. Her late husband would have cursed the leak, cursed her, cursed the house. He would have left her to deal with it, to sleep in the damp and the cold. Silas grabbed his coat and a hammer. He looked at Elara for a brief moment. "Stay with the children," he said, and then he was out the door, into the teeth of the storm. Elara's heart pounded. She could hear him on the roof, the heavy thud of his boots and the sharp, rhythmic sound of his hammer against the shingles, fighting the wind and the rain. He was out there, in the chaos, mending what was broken. Inside, Lily's sobs had subsided to whimpers. Elara held her close, her gaze fixed on the door. Caleb, who had been watching everything with wide eyes, slid off his chair. He walked over to his small bed, picked up the woolen blanket his mother had made, and walked to where Elara sat with Lily. He held it out. He didn't say a word. He just offered the blanket, his most prized possession. Elara's eyes filled with tears. She accepted it, wrapping it around a now sleepy Lily. "Thank you, Caleb," she whispered. He gave a small, shy nod and retreated to his chair, but he sat a little closer to the fire, a little closer to them. The storm raged for another hour, but inside the small, warm room, something had shifted. The hammering on the roof stopped. A few minutes later, Silas returned, drenched and dripping, his hair plastered to his forehead. He closed the door, shutting out the storm's fury. He hung his wet coat by the fire and simply nodded toward the ceiling. The leak was fixed. He had stood against the storm and won. The house was secure again. That night, Elara did not lock her door. The town of Redemption was little more than a dusty street, and a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled together as if for warmth. It was a place where people came to forget or to be forgotten. It was also a place where news, like tumbleweeds, traveled on the wind. Two men rode into town, their horses sweating and their faces mean. They were the Henderson brothers, Jed and Marcus. Jed was the older, a big, bear-like man with a temper that simmered just beneath the surface. Marcus was wiry and weasel-faced, his eyes constantly darting, missing nothing. They dismounted in front of the saloon, their spurs jingling a discordant tune on the boardwalk. They were not there for a drink. They were hunting. Inside, they cornered the bartender, a man whose face was a roadmap of compromises. "We're looking for a woman," Jed said, his voice a low growl. He dropped a coin on the bar. "Traveling with a little girl, pale hair, name of Elara." The bartender's eyes flickered with a brief spark of recognition, which he quickly tried to extinguish. "Lots of folks pass through," he mumbled, wiping the bar with a dirty rag. Marcus leaned in close, his voice a sibilant whisper. "This one's different. She's our kin. Our late brother's widow. We're just looking to take care of her." He smiled, a chilling expression that held no warmth. Heard she might have headed north, toward the lonely country. The bartender, seeing the coldness in their eyes, decided the coin was worth more than his silence. "There was a woman," he admitted, his voice low. "Came through a few weeks back. Looked scared. Bought some flour and salt. Headed north, yeah. Toward the old Miller place." Jed grunted, satisfied. "Who's out there now?" "Man named Silas," the bartender said. "Keeps to himself. Lost his wife a year or so back. Got a boy." Marcus and Jed exchanged a look. A lone man with a child. An easy target. "He stole from us," Jed said to his brother as they left the saloon, his voice thick with a rage that had been festering for months. "Our own brother, robbing his family. and she helped him. She knows where he hid that map. She'll tell us, Marcus said, his lips curling into a cruel smirk. One way or another. Back at the farm, the world was deceptively peaceful. The sun shone, the air was clean, and the only sounds were the call of a crow and the distant lowing of a cow. But the peace was a fragile veneer. That night, Elara's past came for her in her sleep. She was back in the house with her husband, the air thick with the smell of whiskey and his rage. His voice, a venomous whisper, echoed in her dreams, his hands reaching for her. She cried out, a strangled, terrified sound that cut through the silence of the house. She woke with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs, the phantom smell of whiskey still in her nostrils. The room was dark, but she was not alone. In the faint moonlight, slanting through the window, she saw a shape standing just outside her open door. It was Silas. He did not move, did not speak. He was just there, a silent sentinel, a guardian at the gate of her nightmares. He had heard her cry and had come to stand watch. He was not intruding on her grief, merely standing by it, a solid presence against the terrors of the night. After a long moment, when he was sure she was truly awake and the nightmare had receded, he retreated as silently as he had come. The next morning, as they sat at the table for a breakfast of oats and milk, the silence felt different. It was not empty. It was filled with the weight of the unspoken events of the night. Elara looked at Silas, at the deep lines around his eyes. She had to give him something, a piece of the truth he now stood guard over. "My husband," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "He promised me a good life. He promised safety." She paused, her gaze dropping to her hands, which were clenched in her lap. He was a liar. Silas did not reply with platitudes or questions. He just looked at her, his stormy eyes holding a new depth of understanding. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was enough. He had heard her, and he believed her. The past was no longer just hers to carry alone. The rhythm of their lives settled into a new pattern, one marked by small, tentative steps toward connection. The mending continued, a constant, tangible metaphor for the slow healing of their broken lives. One afternoon, Silas sat on the porch steps, showing Caleb how to properly oil and mend a brittle leather rein. His large, calloused hands moved with a surprising grace, guiding his son's smaller, clumsier ones. He didn't use many words, just quiet murmurs of steady now and not too much. Caleb, for his part, was rapt, his usual withdrawn silence replaced by a focused concentration. He was learning his father's language, the language of fixing what is broken. Across the yard, in a patch of sunlight by the kitchen door, Elara was teaching Lily how to sew a button onto a small cloth doll. Her own movements were just as patient, her voice a soft counterpoint to the deep murmur of Silas's. "Through the hole, that's right," she encouraged, as Lily's small fingers struggled with the needle and thread. "And pull it tight." The two scenes played out in a quiet, domestic parallel, two parents passing on the skills of survival and creation to their children. Lily, ever the bold one, looked up from her doll and across the yard at Silas. "Mr. Silas," she called out, her voice clear as a bell. "Why are you always so quiet?" The question hung in the air. Silas stopped his work, the leather rein held loosely in his hand. He didn't look at Lily. Instead, his gaze lifted and met Elara's across the distance. It was a long, searching look. In his eyes, she saw a flicker of the immense weight he carried, the grief that had stolen his words. He offered no answer, but the shared glance was more eloquent than any speech. He was asking her if she understood. Her soft, almost imperceptible nod told him that she did. The next day, a small crisis erupted. Lily's favorite doll, the one she had been sewing, was accidentally stepped on when one of the cows got loose from its pen. Its wooden legs snapped clean in two. Lily's wails were heartbreaking. She clutched the broken toy to her chest, inconsolable. Elara comforted her as best she could, but the doll was beyond her ability to repair. That evening, after Lily had cried herself to sleep, Elara saw Silas pick up the broken doll from the table where she'd left it. He took it with him out to the barn. She saw the flicker of his lantern inside for over an hour. The following morning, when Lily woke, the doll was sitting on her pillow. Its leg was not just repaired, it was stronger than before. A new piece of wood had been seamlessly carved and fitted, held in place by a tiny, perfect wooden peg. A faint scent of pine clung to it. Lily's gasp of delight was a sunbeam breaking through clouds. She hugged the doll tightly and ran out to the porch where Silas was drinking his morning coffee. "You fixed her," she cried, holding up the doll. "You fixed her." Silas looked down at the joyful child, and the corners of his mouth lifted in the barest hint of a smile. He reached out and ruffled her hair, a gesture of affection so unexpected it made Elara's breath catch. His eyes found Elara's over Lily's head. This time, the look they shared was different. It was not a question, not an explanation. It was a moment of shared creation, a silent acknowledgement that together they could mend more than just fences and dolls. The fragile foundation of their arrangement was hardening into something far more solid, something that was beginning to feel terrifyingly like hope. The peace was shattered on a Tuesday. The sun was high and hot, beating down on the dry earth. Elara was hanging laundry on the line, the white sheets brilliant against the blue sky. Lily was chasing butterflies near the porch, and Caleb was, for the first time, helping his father mend a section of fence not far from the house. It was a picture of domestic tranquility, a scene so normal it felt like a dream. Then came the dust cloud on the horizon, rising from the direction of town. It was not a lone rider. It was two. Silas saw it first. He stopped his work, his hand freezing on the fence post. His body went still, every line of it taut with a sudden, sharp attention. Caleb saw the change in his father and fell silent, his own small face turning toward the approaching riders. Elara felt the shift in the air before she even saw the cause. A cold dread, a familiar and unwelcome companion, seeped into her bones. She dropped a wet sheet into her basket and hurried Lily onto the porch, her hand a firm, protective weight on her daughter's shoulder. "Go inside, both of you," Silas said, his voice low and calm, but carrying an unmistakable command. He did not turn to look at them. His eyes were fixed on the riders, who were now close enough to be identified. The Henderson brothers. Elara's blood ran cold. She herded the children into the house, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She peered through the window, her knuckles white where she gripped the sill. Silas did not retreat. He walked slowly from the fence line to the woodpile near the house, picked up his axe, and began to split a log. The motion was rhythmic, steady, almost casual, but Elara knew it was a performance. The axe was heavy in his hands, its polished head gleaming in the sun. It was both a tool and a weapon. The Hendersons reined in their horses just outside the main gate, the same gate Elara had stood at, desperate and broken, weeks before. Jed, the big one, swung down from his horse. Marcus remained mounted, his weaselly eyes scanning the property, taking in the house, the barn, the woman he could just make out in the window. "That's Silas," Jed called out, his voice a belligerent boom that tore through the quiet air. "We've come for what's ours." Silas finished splitting the log with a clean, sharp crack. He rested the axe head on the chopping block and turned to face them. He did not raise his voice. "You've got no business here." "Our business is with the woman," Jed sneered, taking a step toward the gate. "The widow, Elara. Send her out." "She's not going anywhere," Silas said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but it carried the weight of an iron door slamming shut. Marcus laughed, a high, unpleasant sound. "Look at this," playing the hero. "She's not your woman. She's Henderson property, same as the land her husband was meant to inherit." The insult was designed to provoke, to incite a foolish rage. But Silas did not rise to the bait. He simply stood his ground, a pillar of unyielding coal. He looked from Yet's brutish face to Marcus's cunning one. He saw the greed and the cruelty that had driven Elara across 100 miles of wilderness. He thought of her nightmare, of the faded bruises on her skin. "She's not a thing to claim," Silas said, his voice dropping even lower. Yet each word was as clear and sharp as a shard of glass. "This is my land. You are not welcome on it. Turn around and ride away." Yet's face purpled with rage. He put his hand on the butt of the pistol at his hip. "Or what? You and that axe going to stop us?" Silas's eyes flickered to the porch, to the rifle that always leaned against the wall just inside the door, well within his reach. The Hendersons saw the look. They saw the man before them, a man who was not afraid, a man who was on his own ground, a man who was defending his home. They were two, and he was one, but they felt the balance of power shift. "This ain't over," Marcus hissed, pulling on his reins. "We'll be back, and we'll bring enough men to tear this whole place down to get what we came for." They wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving a trail of dust and threats hanging in the air. Silas watched them go, his hands still resting on the handle of the axe, until they were nothing more than a speck on the horizon. That night, the house was filled with a new kind of silence. It was not the silence of strangers coexisting. It was the heavy, charged silence that precedes a breaking storm. The threat the Hendersons had left behind lingered in the air, a poison that had seeped through the walls. The children were put to bed early, their small faces drawn with a worry they didn't fully understand, but could feel in the tension of the adults. Lily clung to Elara, and Caleb stayed close to his father, as if seeking comfort in their proximity. When the house was finally quiet, Silas lit a single lamp and placed it on the table. He sat in his usual chair. Elara sat opposite him. The flimsy pretext of their arrangement had been torn away by the afternoon's confrontation. They were no longer just a man and a woman sharing a roof for convenience. They were allies, facing a common enemy. "They think I have a map," Elara said, her voice barely a whisper. The words, held back for so long, came tumbling out, a confession and an explanation. "My husband, Thomas. He was the youngest Henderson, not like them, or so I thought. He was always trying to prove himself. Before he died, he told me he'd found a way to get us free. He bragged that he'd stolen something valuable from his family, a map. It supposedly leads to a silver claim their father hid away years ago." She shook her head, a bitter smile touching her lips. "He died of a fever 2 days later. I never saw any map. I don't think it ever existed. It was just another one of his lies, another empty promise. But they don't believe that. They think I have it. They think I'm their ticket to a fortune." She finally looked up, meeting Silas's steady gaze. She had laid her secrets bare, the ugly, tangled truth of her past. She expected to see judgment, or perhaps weariness, in his eyes. Instead, she saw only a quiet empathy. She had shared her story. Now the silence was his to fill. He looked down at his hands, which rested on the table. They were strong, calloused, capable of both mending a fence and wielding an axe. For a long moment, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with disuse. The words pulled from a deep, painful place. "My wife," he began, the word catching in his throat. "Her name was Sarah. She died here, in that room." He gestured with his head toward the closed door of his own bedroom. "When Caleb was born." He swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw tight. "The birthing was hard. It went on too long. We were too far from town, too far from a doctor. I thought I could handle it. I thought I was strong enough to see us through." His voice cracked, a fissure in the stone of his composure. "I was a fool. I built this house, this life, so far from everyone. I thought I was keeping her safe. Instead, I isolated her. I killed her with my pride. The confession hung in the air between them, a raw and agonizing truth. His silence was not born of emptiness, but of a grief so profound it had swallowed his words, a guilt he had carried alone for years. Elara felt her own pain receding in the face of his. They were two sides of the same coin. She had been betrayed by a man's lies, and he was haunted by a truth he could not escape. They were both survivors of promises, spoken and unspoken, that had been broken. "It wasn't your fault, Silas," she said softly, her voice filled with the conviction she felt to her core. He looked at her, his stormy eyes glistening with unshed tears. For the first time, he let her see past the stoic protector to the broken man beneath. In that moment, by the light of a single flickering lamp, the last wall between them crumbled into dust. They were no longer just a man and a woman, a father and a mother. They were Silas and Elara, and they would face what was coming together. The rising sun brought no warmth, only the cold certainty of what was to come. The Hendersons would be back, and they would not come for a conversation. There was no discussion of running. The thought never even crossed their minds. This patch of land, this small wooden house, had become more than a sanctuary. It was a home, forged in shared silence and now bonded by shared truth. To flee would be to let the past win. The day was spent in preparation. The air was thick with a grim, focused purpose. Silas moved with the deadly efficiency of a man, preparing for war. He started by reinforcing the doors, hammering thick wooden bars across them. He boarded up the windows on the ground floor, leaving only small slits, just wide enough to see through, just wide enough for the barrel of a rifle. He worked without a word, each swing of his hammer a defiant blow against the coming darkness. Elara, to his surprise, did not cower or retreat into the role of a frightened woman. The resilience that had carried her across the prairie now hardened into a fierce resolve. She became his quartermaster. She gathered all the ammunition they had, laying out the cartridges in neat rows on the kitchen table. She filled every bucket and basin with water. She tore strips from old sheets, preparing bandages for wounds they both knew were possible. Her hands, which had so recently learned to sew and bake, now learned the cold, heavy weight of a rifle. Silas brought in the spare Winchester from the barn. It was older, but well-oiled and true. He showed her how to load it, how to work the lever action, how to sight down the barrel. He expected her to flinch, to be hesitant. She was not. She listened intently, her expression serious, her movements sure and steady as she mimicked his. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a defender of her home, of her child, of this fragile new life. The children watched, their play forgotten. They understood the gravity of the preparations. The fear was in their eyes, but something else was there too, a reflection of the adults' resolve. Caleb, who had once been a ghost in his own home, was now a solid presence. He followed his father, handing him nails and tools before he even had to ask, a silent apprentice in the art of fortification. He filled the wood box by the hearth until it was overflowing, his small arms straining with the weight of the logs. Lily, seeing Caleb's industry, set about her own task. She gathered up all her toys, including the mended doll, and put them in a small wooden crate which she pushed under her bed. It was her way of protecting her own small world. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the yard, Silas and Elara stood for a moment in the main room of their fortress. The house was dark, the boarded windows allowing only slivers of light. Silas checked his rifle, the click of the action loud in the tense quiet. Elara stood by the table, his spare rifle leaning against it. "You and the children stay in the back room when they come," Silas said, his voice low. "Bar the door from the inside." Elara shook her head. "No," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "I will not hide. I learned to load this rifle. I can use it." She looked at him, her eyes clear and defiant. "You said my child needed a father, and yours a mother. A mother protects her children. I will stand with you." Silas looked at her, truly saw her, not as the desperate refugee who had appeared at his gate, but as the strong, formidable woman who stood before him now. He saw the steel in her spine, the fire in her eyes. He gave a single sharp nod of acknowledgment. The last of the sun dipped below the horizon. The world outside went quiet, a deep, expectant hush. The wait began. Dusk bled into a starless, moonless night. The only light came from the single lamp on the table, its flame casting long, dancing shadows that turned the familiar room into a landscape of looming shapes. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, was a potential threat. Silas stood by the front window, peering through the narrow slit. Elara was positioned at a side window, the spare rifle resting on the sill. The children were huddled together on the mattress near the hearth, Caleb's arm protectively around Lily's shoulders. The silence stretched, tightening their nerves like a wire. Then, a sound. The distant, unmistakable drumming of hoofbeats. Not 2 riders this time, but many. They were coming. Silas didn't move. "They're here," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Stay down." The hoofbeats grew louder, a thundering wave of malice approaching the house. They stopped just beyond the fence line. Voices carried on the night air, rough and angry. "Silas, we know you're in there." It was Jed Henderson's voice, amplified by rage. "Send out the woman and the girl, and we'll let you and the boy live." Silas remained silent. There would be no negotiation. A gunshot cracked through the night, a bullet thudding into the thick wood of the front door. The siege had begun. The next hour was a blur of chaos, noise, and adrenaline. The Hendersons, emboldened by their numbers and the whiskey they had surely consumed, launched a full assault. They fired at the house from the darkness, their shots splintering wood and shattering the remaining panes of glass in the upper windows. Silas was a study in deadly calm. He did not waste a single shot. Each time he fired his rifle, the roar was followed by a cry of pain from the darkness outside. He moved between the windows, a phantom in the gloom, his movements precise and economical. He was not a soldier, but he was a man defending his world, and that made him something far more dangerous. Elara's heart pounded in her ears, but her hands were steady. She watched, she waited. A shadow detached itself from the darkness and made a run for the side of the house, hoping to find a weak spot. It was Marcus, his weasel-like face illuminated for a second by a muzzle flash. He reached the wall just below her window, a crowbar in his hand, ready to pry at the boards. Elara's breath hitched. This was it. She leveled the rifle, the one Silas had taught her to use. She remembered his words, breathe out and squeeze. She aimed, fired, and the recoil slammed the stock into her shoulder. The roar of the gun in the enclosed space was deafening. Outside, Marcus screamed and fell, clutching a shattered arm. He scrambled back into the darkness, whimpering. Elara leaned against the wall, trembling, the smell of gunpowder sharp in her nostrils. She had done it. She had fought back. A new wave of firing erupted from the attackers, angrier now, more desperate. Bullets peppered the walls. One found its way through a crack and ricocheted around the room with a terrifying whine. Silas pushed her and the children further back. Get down. He yelled, firing back into the night. The fight raged on, a brutal exchange of fire. One of the Hendersons tried to set the barn alight, but Silas's shot was true, and the man fell before the flames could catch. Slowly, the return fire began to dwindle. The shouts became fewer, the resolve of the attackers broken by the unyielding defense of the silent man in the house. Finally, a ragged retreat. The sound of galloping horses faded into the distance, leaving behind a profound ringing silence. The battle was over. The aftermath was a landscape of stark contrasts. Outside, the darkness was littered with the consequences of violence. Inside, a fragile sanctuary held its breath. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air, a bitter incense. The children, who had been preternaturally silent throughout the fight, finally broke. Lily's sobs were muffled against Caleb's shoulder. Caleb held her tight, his own small body trembling. The siege was over, but the terror remained. Then, a low groan from near the door. Silas. Elara rushed to his side. He was slumped against the wall, his face pale in the lamplight. A dark stain was spreading across his left sleeve, just below the shoulder. He'd been hit. "It's nothing," he rasped, trying to push himself up, his pride warring with the pain. "Just a scratch." "Be still," Elara commanded, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. She helped him to a chair, her hands gentle but sure. She lit another lamp, driving back the shadows, and then fetched the water and the bandages she had prepared. All the pretense that had once defined their relationship was gone, burned away in the heat of the battle. She carefully cut away the fabric of his shirt. The bullet had passed clean through the fleshy part of his arm. It was painful and bleeding heavily, but it could have been so much worse. As she cleaned the wound, her touch was focused and tender. He watched her, his usual stoicism cracked, his eyes filled with a raw vulnerability. Her proximity, her care, was more intimate than any embrace. Her fingers brushed against his skin, and a current passed between them, a silent acknowledgment of the bond that had been forged in shared peril. He had fought for her. She had fought alongside him. When the wound was cleaned and tightly bandaged, she looked up, her face inches from his. Their eyes met. The ghosts of the past, his guilt, her fear had been exorcised by the night's violence. There was only the present, only this quiet room, only the two of them. "Elara," he said. Just her name. But in his voice it was a poem, a prayer, a vow. It held all the words he had never been able to say. "Silas," she whispered back, her own voice thick with emotion. It was enough. It was everything. The sun began to rise, its first pale fingers of light probing through the cracks in the boarded windows. It illuminated a scene of devastation, but also of survival. The children, exhausted, had finally fallen asleep by the hearth, still entwined. Elara helped the weakened Silas to the porch. They stood together, looking out at the new day. The air was cool and clean. The world felt washed new. A few months later, the scene was transformed. The boards were gone from the windows. The bullet holes in the walls had been patched and the wood stained, leaving only faint scars. A small garden bloomed with color near the porch, a patch of defiant life that Elara had planted. The farm was thriving. It was autumn. The leaves on the lone cottonwood tree were turning to gold. Silas, his arm fully healed, was teaching both Caleb and Lily how to carve small, simple shapes from pieces of scrap wood. Laughter, clear and genuine, now echoed in the yard. Elara sat on the porch steps, watching them, a real smile on her face. They were a family, not born of blood, but of choice, of trial, of a shared will to mend what was broken. They were a testament to the fact that home is not a place you find, but a thing you build. The seasons turned, each one a chapter in their healing. The harsh winter came and went, blanketing the land in a quiet peace, the house a warm, beating heart in the snow. They spent the long evenings by the fire, the silence between them no longer a void, but a comfortable, shared space. It was a silence filled with the soft scratch of Silas's carving knife, the whisper of Elara's needle through cloth, and the sleeping breaths of their children. Spring arrived with a rush of green, a promise of renewal that felt deeply personal. The mended fence now enclosed a field of new growth. The flower garden Elara had planted exploded in a riot of color. The house, once a fortress of solitude, was now simply a home, open to the light. The children thrived. Caleb, no longer a shadow of his father, had found his voice. He was still quiet, but it was a thoughtful quiet now, not a fearful one. He would talk to Elara for hours while she worked in the garden, his questions about the world full of a newfound curiosity. Lily, a vibrant little sunbeam, adored Silas. She would follow him around the farm, her endless chatter a constant, cheerful melody against the rhythm of his work. He would listen patiently, the stern lines of his face often softening into a quiet smile. He carved her a whole family of wooden animals, each one a small token of his silent affection. One warm summer evening, Silas and Elara sat on the porch swing he had built, a gentle creak marking their slow rhythm. The children were chasing fireflies in the twilight, their laughter like tiny bells in the gathering dark. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They watched their children, their family, and their quiet contentment was a language all its own. "I never saw a map," Elara said softly, breaking the peaceful silence. Silas turned to look at her. "I know," he said. He had always known. The map was never the point. "Do you ever think about them?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The Hendersons." Silas followed her gaze to the horizon, where the last light of day was fading. "No," he said, his voice simple and final. "The past was a closed book." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. It was a gesture that was both a comfort and a promise. This was their life now, the one they had built together from the ashes of their old ones. This was their truth. The narrator's voice, the storyteller who has guided us through this journey, now steps forward. So here ends the story of Silas and Elara, two strangers brought together by desperation, who found in each other the missing pieces of their own souls. They were not poets. They did not speak of love in grand pronouncements. Their love was written in a mended roof, in a shared meal, in the steady presence of one another against the storms of the world. It was a love built not on flowery words, but on the solid foundation of a quiet vow spoken in the language of action and sacrifice. They learned that a family is not always a thing of blood, but often a thing of choice, a fortress built by broken people who decide to stand together and face the darkness. Before you go, I ask you to consider this. What is it that truly makes a home? Is it the wood and nails of a house, or the land on which it stands? Or is it something quieter, something more profound? Perhaps a true home is simply the safe harbor of another's heart, and the silent, unspoken promise to be the one who stands watch through the long, dark night.